And welcome to today's Monday Morning Modernism with John Seed. I'm so sad to see this come to an end. We're going to do a brief kind of a hiatus after today's presentation, but we will be back. So I'm Martha Jordan. I'm the owner of Winslow Art Center, and I just want to thank you all for coming, for participating, and most of all, thank you, John Seed, for working with me. It's such a pleasure, and I'll just wait till you surprise me with the next fantastic thing you're going to do with me. And until then, I hope everybody enjoys this kind of, as I said, pièce de résistance about Jean-Michel Basquiat. And who better to present this than John Seed? So without further ado, I'm just going to turn things over to you, John. Let me just change the spotlight. Thank you. And thank you, John Seed.
All right, thank you, Martha. And I'm going to go right to screen share. All right, well, welcome everybody. And I gave this presentation the title Jean-Michel Basquiat as I Knew Him, because if you've read my blog, or people who know me a bit know that I have Basquiat stories. And I honestly think that my encounters with him, it's one of the reasons I became a writer, because for years I've been telling people these stories, and people started saying to me, John, you've got to write that one down. That's crazy. So I give him a lot of credit for that, and definitely a very powerful encounter when I was just out of college and finding my way in the art world. So this won't be maybe as scholarly as the other lectures. It'll be more personal, a little bit more quirky, and just hopefully very entertaining as well. So who was Jean-Michel Basquiat? Let me go sideways first and just say that there are now a number of very, very good books about him. So if you come away from today interested, there are so many books. There are a couple of movies, and maybe toward the end I'll comment on those and make some recommendations. So you can learn a lot about Basquiat. I've mainly learned about him from reading, because I knew him, so that was just a matter of a few months where I kind of got a window into his life. But here's what I've learned. He was of Haitian Puerto Rican descent and grew up mainly in New York City. He did have time in Puerto Rico growing up. He traveled a bit, but contrary to what you might believe, because he had a reputation as a teenager as a street kid, he actually lived in a box on Washington Square Park at one point. That was because he quarreled with his father. His father really was a middle-class man. He was a Haitian-born accountant, drove a Mercedes. But Jean's mother had all kinds of struggles with her mental health when he was a boy and a teenager. And all of this led to a kind of a tumultuous childhood for him. He also was sexually abused when he was a kid in Puerto Rico. So after, quarrels with his father, not doing well with school, being rebellious, all those kinds of teenage problems, by the time he was a mid-teenager, he really was out on the streets of New York finding himself. And I think of him as a self-educated person. I think he got a certain education on the streets that you wouldn't get, another way. He also educated himself in the art museums of New York. And his mother apparently took him to museums when he was younger. He saw Picasso's Guernica with his mother. She had an interest in art. One thing that really shaped him, he was hit by a car, I think when he was maybe before he was 10. So he spent time in the hospital, and that was a morbid, frightening experience for him. So all these things added up. And by the time you see him here in this photo, which maybe would have been about 1979, he was a tagger. He was an artist making graffiti on the street. Eventually, along with a friend of his, he shared a tag. He shared a name, SAMO, S-A-M-O, which I understand stands for same old, like same old shit, rebellious title. And there was a movie where he showed up in about 1980 that documented some of his tagging. And a big part of what he always did and what he was known for was there was a sort of a poetry about these tags, about the inscriptions that he left. And I think one of the key things to understand about Basquiat is if you just say visual artist, I think you're missing something important. He was clearly a kind of a poet, or a writer, if you want to see it that way. And writing in and on his work was a very, very important part of his practice. So here you can see an early work. I think this is from about 1980 of a car crash. Maybe it brought up that experience of being hit, by a car as a kid. And you can see it has some scrawled lettering, maybe a street name where he saw something happen, a little bit a la Cy Twombly. And mentioning Cy Twombly, let me tell you something that I've come to understand about Jean. He really saw himself as very influenced by American abstract art that he saw in New York and saw in the museums. So he loved Cy Twombly. He loved Franz Klein. He loved all of those abstract painters. So that, he was very knowledgeable, even though his early artwork looks, really direct and childlike and explosively scrawled. There was a lot of sophistication behind it. And the theme that came up as his work developed, that came up immediately and naturally, was the theme of race and racism. And I think that's one of the things that vaulted him to public attention, because there hadn't been a well-known artist of color. There hadn't been an artist that really dealt with racism so directly and so brutally. So here on The Irony of the Negro Policeman, he has a kind of like a Haitian, almost like a voodoo figure. I think he called them cabezas, a skull or a head that occupies this kind of electrified body, flattened body, like a Dubuffet body. And he has a paw, you notice, that's labeled rather than a hand. And he looks out at you like maybe a kind of a jolly figure, but also a figure of death. And it's unlike any kind of imagery that I think anybody had seen in the galleries ever. Maybe it was closest to Expressionism. And for context, let me go one ahead and I'll go back to that one. I remember, because I was in art school and then finishing art school in 81 and 82, that there was a rise of what you would call neo-expressionism out of New York. And all the painters that you see here were friends of Jean-Michel's: Francesco Clementi, Kenny Scharf, who used Flintstone imagery, Keith Haring, who made a lot of public art and street art like Jean did. There was this explosion of new talent. And the context was, you want to remember that beginning in the January of 81, Ronald Reagan was president. So on the political surface of things, there was a kind of, Jimmy Carter was gone. There was kind of a new Republican conservatism. There was a nostalgia about the period officially, but underneath it, there was all this brooding youth energy. It was the beginning of MTV. The AIDS crisis came along very, very rapidly. And I think in the work of Jean and those artists, you see that kind of boiling that's going on, the social unrest that's going on underneath, yuppies and MBAs and driving BMWs, under all the affluence. There was this whole countercultural vibe wanting to explode. And this was a very famous show he had in 1982 at a place called the Fun Gallery. You can see one of the paintings that was there. They were made with slats that were nailed together at the corners and stretched very, very roughly. And those were done by a friend of his named Stephen Torton. So more about that later. And when you look at a Basquiat, when you start to look at these works from 82 and 83, which were so vibrant, they're disjointed. And disjointed was part of his aesthetic, because I think, being self-taught, he was putting together ancient history, the Bible, Christian imagery, ironic history, maybe from the 19th and 20th century. So we have a black sansom here between two columns, and the columns have asbestos in between them, that's a 20th century problem. We have a man with a top hat who is an obnoxious liberal with a crown floating above his head, kind of screaming, "Not for sale." And there's a cowboy with a lot of money on the other side, with his penis hanging out of his boxer shorts. There's all kinds of, crazy ribald satire and collisions of culture coming together in this work. One thing that I think is fantastic about Basquiat is that he had an idea of drawing which was unlike any idea of drawing, I heard of before this. There's a story about Basquiat that he was on an airliner once going from New York to California, which he did a lot. And he had something kind of like this out on his tray table, and he was making, a long string of words. Like this one, I think, has plaid 30 or 40 times. And someone coming down the aisle went over and looked at him and said, "Oh, are you making a list?" And he looked up and just said really clearly, "No, I'm drawing." This was drawing, the creation of words, the crossing out, the development of poetry, the automatism of all of it. And here we've got a Western diet of settlers and movies was beans, mostly lard. That shows up with train tracks being built by Chinese for chump change. So it's like a Cliff's Note from hell is I think the way I would put it. Is he was rewriting history in this kind of freeform poetry. Yes, he had a relationship with Madonna, and I met her briefly when she came to see him one time. So there were a couple of rising stars. I don't think she was Madonna quite yet when they were dating, not the way that she was a breakout star later. This showed up on the internet. Apparently someone once asked him for his resume, and he wrote this in his notebook. And you can see what his resume was. His education was nil, because it's true, he really had fought with teachers and dropped out of school pretty early. Experience is crossed out, but he's had interviews, and look at the references. You know, Robert Rauschenberg, Divine, Chris Burden, and Dick Tracy and Tennessee Williams. You know, those are his, Johnny Carson, those are his references. So what he said about this early period, this is kind of an honest statement later. He says, well, I had some money. I made the best paintings ever. I was completely reclusive, worked a lot, and took a lot of drugs, and I was awful to people. And that's exactly how I knew him, because I was one of the people he was awful to. That is just the picture of the guy I knew in 82 and 83. So there he is kind of before I met him. One more painting, the all-colored cast, where again, you can see this collision of American popular culture. By the way, he once said that his subject matter was royalty and the streets. He had a really great interest in, from the war period and after, famous African Americans, boxers, athletes, musicians. You know, he loved jazz and often played it on his record player. So here we've got Jersey Joe Walcott mixed in with Alexander the Great in a patois, right? With the bits of Latin, bits of Haiti with a bone, like a shaman might wave, arrows pointing up and down to stairs and a lightning bolt and to China. You know, fantastic kind of array of associations. To give you a feeling of what was it like to hear him speak and, you know, what was his presence, there's this kind of precious interview that you can see on YouTube. And I think there's a longer version available, but I've got the 3-minute version. And you can just kind of get a feeling for what it was like when he was in the room and what he was speaking and what he would have said to you. So a 3-minute interview, and then I'll go back to saying a little bit more.
You're what, Haitian Puerto Rican? Is that?
Yeah, I was born here, but yeah, my mother's first generation Puerto Rican. Father comes from Haiti.
No. Do you feel that that's in your art?
Genetically?
Yeah, genetically or
Yeah, I guess so.
Culturally. I mean, from your
Culturally.
I mean, for instance, I mean, Haiti is of course famous for its art.
Yeah, that's why I say genetically, because I've never been there.
Yeah.
And you know, and I grew up in, you know, a pretty typical American vacuum, you know.
In a
television mostly.
Yeah. No Haitian primitives on your wall.
At home?
At home.
Haitian primitives? I mean, people?
No. I mean,
nailed up on my
paintings.
walls?
Paintings.
No. Just, you know, the typical prints, you know, like you'd find any home in America. Well, some homes in America, but nothing really special.
Yeah, and so you wouldn't really attribute anything in your work to those roots.
Probably the frustration of the way I grew up probably has something to do with it, you know.
You think there's frustration in your art?
No, but I think frustration probably caused me to do a lot of it, you know. Like, you know, I had to leave home to go out. In a way, do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like my whole life, I went to school and I came home, and that was it, you know. Like I really didn't have any friends or anything. I just kind of like just stayed home, went to school. I mean, over and over again. I went to the movies once in a while.
Yeah. And so you were started drawing as a way of.
Well, no, I always enjoyed drawing, you know. But what I'm saying is that I couldn't really do anything, you know. So once I left home, you know, so I started doing all that drinking and throwing bottles and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and drawing on the streets,
Yeah.
which was so, and that was rooted in a frustration.
I'd say so.
Mm.
Sound of his voice and his mannerisms and that kind of stone reticence that was there. The photo that was taken by Stephen Torton probably just a week or two before I met him. I think I remember that suit. There he is out on Santa Monica Boulevard. By the time he came out to LA to live with Larry Gagosian, lived downstairs, he had a lot of money. And there was a place called Maxfield's that I think is there in the background in the photo on Santa Monica Boulevard where he'd shop. Had, you know, Armani suits, fine ties, often things that were kind of paint spattered, but he was really on the way up, and he was in LA to have his second show in Los Angeles. And just for a counterpoint, I was so much the opposite. I was the kid who had done well in school. I was a nice white kid in a polo shirt from Macy's, you know, so there's all kinds of reasons why I think when I walked into his studio, it was kind of a collision. The way I met Jean first, I met him through his art. I needed a job. I'd come back from Berkeley. I'd finished my master's, and I had read about Gagosian Gallery in Art Week. So I had a Toyota truck. I drove it down there, walked into Gagosian Gallery, and Larry said, great, you know, I need somebody, you know, $1,000 a month, and you can help me out with errands. And the first day I was in the gallery, I saw this painting, which is now in the Broad collection by Basquiat. And I had never seen a Basquiat. I'd never heard of him, didn't know what this meant. I think I was saying the other day, I thought, is that a French or a Belgian name? I was really curious about it. And the painting just electrified me. I mean, I really did have that feeling like of hairs standing on end, which almost is what the painting is about. This kind of crazy, electrified death's head, you know, out of like a completely different kind of culture. It was so bright. It was so unfamiliar. It was so dazzling. So it made me really, really curious. Within, I think, a week or two, Larry said to me, well, look, why don't you go over to my place in Venice? Jean-Michel is living downstairs and he needs your help. So I drove down there, and the building is still there. That's really what it looked like in the 80s when I used to go down there. It's a palazzo designed by an architect named Robert Mangurian. And Larry had built it with some of his early money he made selling prints in Westwood, kind of fantastic, beautiful designer house down by the ocean. So I knocked at the door, and Jean-Michel came to the door naked. You know, that was first of all, that was surprising, but, you know, ran and got a towel and wrapped himself up and invited me in. And he was very, very gentle. He had kind of a high, quiet voice, you know, just showed me what he had there, told me what he needed. And I came back a number of times, helped him with errands, took him to buy art supplies, and kind of became his driver, because the friend who had brought him from New York, Stephen Torton, had a fight with Jean and took off. And together they'd been driving, I think it was an early 1950s, like a Dodge or a Plymouth, really old American car. And I talked to Stephen a few years ago. He said one time the brakes went out on the 405 on the San Diego freeway, and Jean just said, kept driving. So, you know, they had driven together, you know, brakeless in a 50s car on the 405 freeway, but Stephen had taken off, and I was the new, you know, assistant. So he was working on the floor of this studio. He had a little, you know, like a single mattress that was on the floor with a blanket on it. He had a little television with, you know, like we used to have rabbit ears that you'd adjust for reception. There were books, there were clothes on the floor. And there also, from time to time, there were bags of money and bags of weed, especially bags of weed. And several people were coming through Larry's place. I think one of the things that Jean liked to do, I think he liked to see who was going to steal from him. And every now and then people did steal. People would take drawings, or people would take drugs or something. And, you know, he would accuse them, because he was very, very tuned into everything that was happening around him. And the chaos was kind of an act, I think. So some stories about this period, and you can just imagine, my eyes were wide open at all of this, at that, you know, that this young artist, at the fact that his paintings were getting so much attention, you know, the milieu around them, the collectors coming in. One of the first things where I dealt with a Basquiat painting, Larry went out of town And this painting was in the gallery on North Robertson. We'd moved to a larger gallery, and it was on a pallet, like a supermarket pallet that you'd find in back of a store. And all it had on it was this. It had Sugar Ray Robinson and then the little floating head and the crown. And a very, very wealthy guy from Texas came in because a friend had told him, you should buy a Basquiat. This is a hot young artist. You should buy it. And it was $5,000. And this guy had a wife who was a supermodel. And they stood there and they're looking at this thing, and they, you know, the big Rolex is hanging off his hand. And the couple started to have an argument because he had decided he should buy it. I mean, $5,000 was nothing to him, and she hated it. And they had a big fight right in front of the painting. I just stood there and let them have their fight. And then eventually they didn't get it, which I'm sure they later regretted. And it kind of just showed me what a you know, what a hot property I was dealing with, that people would have this argument about it, that it was both so desirable and so undesirable at the same time. Another thing that happened, there was a very famous collector named Marcia Weissman in LA. She was one of the founders of the Museum of Contemporary Art, and her brother was Norton Simon, who founded later a museum. And this story, this is secondhand because I wasn't there when this happened, but a gallery employee was there and told me this story. Marcia Weissman, you know, was told you should go see Basquiat, you should look at his art. So she showed up in Venice, and on the floor, he was working on a very wide piece of butcher paper, and he was drawing this image, which looks kind of like a caveman or a troglodyte or a shaman, you know, with bones. And Marcia Weissman looked around at the other canvases and things. He didn't have much to say. He was kind of unfriendly. He just decided he didn't like her. And, you know, she was polite enough, but just decided there was nothing for her to see. So she left. And when she went out the door, Jean put his head up and, you know, said to my friend, "This is Marcia Weissman." And then he added the penis and balls to the image. So there was really kind of a sadomasochistic relationship, I think, between a lot of the clients and between Jean. He really, you know, he bit the hands that fed him for sure. And there's a picture of two gallery employees, you know, with that piece when it was later framed in a big plexi frame and bought into the gallery. You can see they were mocking it. I mean, we didn't know what to do with the art. So I had it in my mind that I should buy a painting. And, you know, to give context, I mentioned this in the other webinar I did. I had worked for art collectors, and I'd bought a few things on installment, and I just realized, you know, I should do what the Texas guy didn't do. I should buy a Basquiat. And I had $2,500 for my student loan. So I wrote a check to Larry for $2,500 and told him, I'll work for you for 2.5 months for free at $1,000 a month. And, you know, I ate out of my parents' fridge. I put all my gas on the Chevron card. You know, somehow I made it 2.5 months, you know, without needing more money. And I brought home the Basquiat and put it in the wall in my bedroom. And in fact, here is my sister Janet posed with it one day at my parents' house. It's really funny to look back at this now, with Basquiat being such a big deal. A couple of years ago, my mother called me. She said, "John, I'm reading Vanity Fair, and there's an article about this famous designer in New York." And she says, "He's got a big Basquiat in his apartment." And then she said to me, she said, "We had one of those once too." I said, "I know we did, Mom. You know, we had what that guy had, you know, long time ago." But after this, I had this maybe a week and a half and 2 weeks. He started calling me on the phone, and he just said, you know, "This painting should go to a collector. You're a nobody, you're a peon, you just work for me. You know, you shouldn't have it. I don't want you to have it." You know, really just got after me, started haranguing me on the phone. And eventually he said, "Look," he said, "Larry will give you back your $5,000. What I'll do is I'll make your portrait. And I've only done Francesco Clementi and Andy Warhol. You'll be the third portrait." And that flattered me. And I thought, okay, $5,000 and a Basquiat portrait, I'll take that. And after his show in LA, he left, got on the plane and left. And this was in the corner of the studio because I had the job of cleaning up the studio. It was a little canvas from Aaron Brothers. It was actually broken at the corner because he had kicked it. And my name was crossed out. Crossing out was something he did a lot. And a little arrow pointing down to hell. And this is my digital reproduction. I never photographed it, but this is kind of how I remember it. It was a red circle, John Seed, White Sambo Gringo, a little arrow down to hell. And I took that home and I put that in the downstairs bedroom. And my dad walked in and had a little talk with me. He said, why would you keep something that is an insult? And I thought, he's right. So I put it in the crate that was going back to Jean in New York and never saw it again. And hopefully that went right in the dumpster. But so I guess technically I've owned 2 Basquiat paintings in my life, which that's what made me a writer. Those are some of the crazy John Seed stories. I ended up, before that, working with Jean. I made all the stretcher bars for the show he had in LA in early '83. And we had a Craftsman saw, in the garage behind our house. So I would go down there, I'd go to Sawtell Lumber and get my Douglas fir 1x2s. Jean made me a drawing of how he wanted triptychs. So I think I made 9 or 10 stretcher bars for him all together. They didn't have the cool corners of the pieces that Stephen Torton did. Now, when I go to the Broad where they have this painting, I look up at that and I say, oh yeah, I remember priming that. I primed it black. I remember taking him to Standard Brands to buy the acrylics. And this one you can see is Dizzy Gillespie and Ornithology. It's jazz, but also alchemy and the name of one of his albums, Ornithology. So all these things put together in a triptych. One more memory. This is just another kind of a random thing, but I remember after he left, I was cleaning up the studio and I saw a big piece of like Arches paper, drawing paper on the floor. And all it had was a little checked off box and it said Lee Harvey Oswald. That was the whole drawing. And that gave me the chills. I thought, well, how do you get to that? That you're just, the name of the guy who killed John Kennedy on a single sheet of paper on the floor. And then I later saw that was in Johnny Depp's collection. Kind of fast forwarding to now. So I have all these memories and all these associations. When I became a writer, I said to myself, I want to better understand Basquiat because I'd had this glimpse of him. I had these collisions with him, but I wanted to understand what's the art really about and how do you break it down? And I took this painting and wrote an article about it, looked it over really, really carefully. And I want to share some of what I came across when I looked into this picture. It's called In Italian, and it's from around the time I knew him. The first thing, when you read some of these words and some of the crossouts, you may notice that the word sangue, which is blood, and has been crossed out with this, Latin word with sangre. So there's kind of his literacy. There's his reading of history. He's going from Italian from Latin. And what I kind of came to understand about this painting, I talked about it with a friend later, is saying in Italian was actually a reference to the idea that graffiti came from ancient Rome, words written on the wall. And it also, as it turns out, it was a little bit about Italian painting. So there are, all kinds of historical little moments and references in these paintings. There's a figure in the center. Apparently it started out to be, Stephen Torton started out to be his friend. Then they fought over a woman and he changed it to Christ and gave it a crown of thorns, although he crossed out, thorns. And again, some of these words and markings appear, but it's worth noting that African-esque Christ-like figures appear in many Basquiat works. The heart image is there. And what I came to understand later is that when he was a kid, when he was in the hospital recovering from the car crash, he had that book Gray's Anatomy that someone had given him. And that's when he really started drawing. He drew, bones, he drew ribs, he drew, body parts, drew imagery of the heart. So I think that when he's got the diagram of the heart pumping blood in the middle of this painting, it's a lot of things. It's a memory of reading Gray's Anatomy as a kid. It also might be a Sacred Heart, might be, a Catholic reference. And it's just something kind of both spiritual and morbid that adds variety to his painting. Here's a wonderful detail. You may notice at the bottom of the painting, there were all these little panels or little canvases, nailed across the bottom. I had to realize when I looked at it that that's a predella. A predella is something you find in Renaissance art where there's like a little narrative story, or a preview is what a predella is, that's on the bottom of an altarpiece. So again, he really is looking at Italian art when he makes his street art. He's got a predella on his painting in Italian. I puzzled a lot over the quarter that's in there. There's a 1951 quarter. It has "In God We Trust," but liberty is crossed out. which I think is interesting. Also, he says 10 cents rather than 25 cents. And one thing I came up with is that 1951, it was a key year in the beginning of the civil rights movement. So that, an 8-year-old, her father had to, protest so she could attend an all-white school. So it's about race and devaluing. And there was a lot that was in Jean's art about official culture and its hypocrisy, how that the history we're told is full of lies and things that need to be crossed out and restated. And finally, we do have a kind of an alien, Pinocchio-nosed green Paul with a single Google eye in this painting. And I looked a little bit into Paul and realized he was somebody who spread the gospel to non-Jews, to Gentiles, one of the most important of the evangelists. And I had to ask myself, does Jean maybe see himself in that role as a bit of a preacher who is spreading his own kind of religion, his view of things? The last time I saw him would have been in early '83, after his show at Gagosian, when he went back to New York City. A couple of things happened then. I think his problems intensified. He certainly had a drug problem, when I knew him, but his problems were multiplying as his money multiplied, and so was his fame. So here's, New York Magazine, I think from 1984 or 1985. And, the paintings were now $25,000 instead of $5,000, had, dealers. He was moving up with dealers. He became a phenomenon, really, after I knew him. He had really looked up to Andy Warhol growing up. I think Andy Warhol was kind of the model of the famous artist. And Jean unapologetically wanted fame, and was really, I think, very, very in charge of what he was doing in the way he courted publicity, in the way he presented himself, even in the kind of the canny interviews. I think he was a lot like Warhol. One thing I remember about him, just to give context to this, once he was at the Gagosian Gallery, and a woman called who was writing a paper about him. She wanted to interview him, and he got on the phone and started talking to her. And at first the phone call went pretty well, but then she told him that he was a graffiti artist, or told him that that's how she was going to write about him. And he was enraged. He was just furious, ended up screaming at her and hanging up at her, because he saw himself as a fine artist. He wanted to be seen as somebody that, you talk about Leonardo da Vinci or Cy Twombly or Picasso, you talk about them all in the same way. And to him, being called a graffiti artist was not the label he wanted. So being associated with Andy Warhol, I think that made him feel validated. Andy Warhol's career had been fading, so Jean-Michel brought something really, really different into his world, and they collaborated. I happen to personally think that these paintings are awful. There's a lot of people now who like them, but to me, the collaboration never really worked. So I'm just putting that out there as my opinion. What Jean described at the time, he says, Andy would start painting, he'd put on something recognizable, which is what he was known for logos and pop art imagery. And then I would sort of deface it. And that was, how they worked together. I try to get him to do some more, I would deface some more. So it's a little bit like an aesthetic of people who somehow cancel each other out, and the energy of the art came from that. I think it's pretty sad to see photos of him toward the end. I think this one photo really says it all. To be fair, I understand that after I knew him, there were a couple people that really worked, for example, to get him off drugs. I think there was at least one girlfriend that really, really worked at that. And I think he was clean for some periods. He also took a trip to Africa, which I think meant a lot to him. And that helped. He apparently came back from that in good spirits. But all in all, he just had problems that were beyond, what he could cope with. So he died of a drug overdose at the age of, I think he was 27, not 28, but the age of 27 in 1988. Fast forward to now, I think the way that we all know Basquiat is we know him as an artist that brings, astonishing jaw-dropping prices, including $110 million for this big cabeza, this big head of 1982. And people ask me, they say, well, John, don't you wish you'd held on to your painting? And, doesn't that dazzle you? What if you could have millions and blah, blah, blah. And I want to say something about that. I think that I was so young, I knew that he was going to be famous, but I didn't understand how famous. I never would have imagined what has happening. And what I've learned about Basquiat is if I had kept that painting, let's say that I'd had more wherewithal or more money, I think I would have had what you call phony friends forever. I think I would have been attracting all kinds of, art dealers and hangers-on and people who wanted, access to me, the Basquiat through me, and they didn't care about me. I mean, I think it would have been a lot of real craziness. And at a certain point, it would have had to go in a bank vault. I mean, you can't hang a painting like that in your house. So it's tempting to think, gosh, there could have been money for me in that, but I think I'm much better off not having had it around. And the painting that I bought, I'm saying that there was a story about that a couple of years ago. It was resold, and the story was that the price was like, it was $12 million or something like that. But the woman who brokered the sale for the elderly owner embezzled $1 million along the way without telling the owner. And then that all ended up in court, and that was a big mess. So just, greed and money and all kinds of madness always swirling around Basquiat. You may have also recently heard the story about the fake Basquiats that showed up at the museum in Orlando. And I'll just say that I heard about those, I think, nearly 10 years before they showed up in public, because people contact me and say, do you recognize these, or could you help authenticate these? And I've learned never give an opinion on whether or not a Basquiat is authentic, because you'll only get in trouble. There's no good that can come from it, even having opinions. So I don't give opinions. There are a few people who do, good luck to them for giving opinions. I think it's a bad idea. And Basquiat is a very, very heavily forged artist. So it's just something to stay away from. But there I am. I take my students to the Broad, and, I get to have my geezer moment. I stand there. Oh yeah, I made that stretcher bar in my dad's garage. I looked around the back to see if my bolts were still there, but it just takes me back. It's a young man's experience. I think when I saw that movie, The Devil Wears Prada, I thought, well, my movie would be The Devil Wears Armani. It would be Larry Gagosian, and maybe someday I'll write that screenplay. Although I was only at the gallery 6 months. I don't know that I have a full screenplay, but I had a lot of fast lane material. And now his father has died. His two sisters are in charge of the estate. And they recently did a show recreating his studio that was very, very popular. People said it was a very powerful and fantastic show. They showed a lot of works that hadn't been seen before. But, from my end, I go into museum stores, and that canvas that I helped stretch, you can buy triple skateboards that have that on it. You can buy plates that have that on it. And this one is kind of my no comment. I don't know what to think of this, but you can go on Amazon for $329.99. You get a Barbie collector Basquiat that comes with a certificate, like a limited work of art. And I am so conflicted, because part of me says, well, if it makes people feel a sense of pride and they feel good, I shouldn't, look down on that. And then part of me says, that's the most commercial thing I've ever seen done to an artist's work. So, I'll leave it out there for you. Maybe we can talk about it and chat your opinions, but he is famous, and that is what he really, really wanted. So it's worth acknowledging. And one quote that I also think is worth really, really taking in, he said, I am not a Black artist. I am an artist. So I'm going to pitch myself now. I'm talking about commercialism. I'll be slightly commercial. If you like my rambling, old time stories, all of them are in this book, which you can read for free if you have Kindle Unlimited. And that's not commercial if it's free. Or there's a paperback you can buy on Amazon. Just search for it. And I have other stories, but the Basquiat stories are the best ones. I mean, you've already kind of heard those for free. But if you like reading, you can get that on Amazon. I also want to just thank everybody who's taken an interest in Monday Morning Modernism. I've gotten to meet a lot of you on social media and in person, and you guys are really interesting. And, watch Martha's website. I'll be in touch with Martha, and maybe by late spring or summer, we will come up with something. We just don't know what.